Hey, so in today's video I want to share with you my whole creation process of this scene that you've seen in the intro, starting from downloading the character and the animation from Mixamo. Then I will show you how to model the cape in a procedural way, so on every stage, even after everything is finished, you will still be able to modify how the cape looks like in terms of geometry and shape. Then we will create the manga style shader for both the character and the cape. Then we will add the action lines to get a sense of speed for our scene, as well as the background to further push this sort of pencil drawn look. And lastly, we will go through the simple technique of animating the camera and rendering the whole thing. But before that, as always, if you manage to use this tutorial for something or create a scene of your own, I would really love to see your creation, so make sure to tag me on Twitter, a link for that is in the description. It really helps me to see that some people actually find these videos useful, and if it isn't too bothersome for you, then I would be really grateful for it. Also, if you want to save time and basically just get the whole scene, the effect, without going through the tutorial, then there is a way for it as well. You can just get it from my Gumroad, link for that is in the description as well. And now let's start with a fresh Blender scene where we will delete everything and go directly to Mixamo to get our character first. Mixamo is an amazing base of free animations and characters which you can use for your scene, so it's gonna be perfect for our case. I'm gonna be using this fly animation with the basic humanoid mesh, but feel free to use any animation or mesh that you want, it should not be a problem. You can also play with those settings here and see what they do, like for example the awareness controls how much the character is moving their head and just looking around. So when you're fine with adjusting those things, make sure that you have in place checked, and then you just hit download and download again. Then you go to File, Import FBX, and you import the animation in Blender, and it should work out of the box. When you hit play, you should see the animation working. Now, one thing that we want to do right away is when you select the armature, you can see that the keyframes only grow from 0 to about 90, 97, 96. And after that, the mesh is just frozen, basically. So what we want is we want to make it loop. So with the armature selected and all the keyframes selected, when you're hovering over with your mouse on the timeline, hit Shift E and choose Make Cyclic. That will make sure that the animation is looping nicely so that we don't have any problem when it comes to the animation length, because otherwise we would have to shorten our animation to 96 frames. So the first step is done. Now let's create the cape. So Shift A, choose Mesh Plane, and because we want to make this cape fully procedural so that you will be able to adjust it however you want even at later stages, we will need to add some modifiers to the stack. So first of all, let's go into the edit mode and move it so that the beginning of our cape is actually in the origin of the world space, because that's where the pivot of the object is. So just make sure that it's somewhere about there. And now go out of the edit mode and let's position it somewhere above our character. Don't have to be too precise, just make sure that it begins to look like a cape. Now again in edit mode, let's add some subdivisions so that we can have some control of the shape of the cape. 3 is more than enough, you should not need more. But if you do, go crazy with it. Just remember, the more vertices, the more geometry you have right now, the more tedious and the harder it's gonna be to control later. And also maybe 2 subdivisions on the horizontal side as well. And now let's choose all the vertices that are here by the shoulders and scale it down so that they don't really exceed our character's shoulders. Something like this. Now we can also scale this one a little bit so that it resembles more of a cape. And we can also choose these 2 vertices and just move it a little bit. Something like this, to make it a little bit more interesting in terms of shape. Now with that done, let's add a modifier, and it's gonna be a subdivision surface. Let's put it at, let's say 3 levels in viewport, and make sure that the render is also 3, so that the render later is gonna come out exactly the same as we see it in the viewport. And then another modifier is gonna be the displace modifier. Here we will need a texture, so click new, and let's call it cloak displacement big. And go down into the texture tab and change the type from image or movie to clouds. Now we can create an empty, which is gonna act as a controller for our noise that is gonna move the cape around. Let's position it somewhere around the same plane as our cape, and then go into the constraint and add object constraint, choose the child of. And then the target is gonna be our cape. Make sure that you name your stuff appropriately, because this scene can get a little bit complicated, and it's just a good practice to keep everything organized when working in 3D basically. So this is gonna be our cape. The empty is gonna be the cape controller, and we add this object constraint so that when you will move your cape, then the empty is gonna move with it. And if you rotate it, then the empty is gonna rotate as well. And that is important because we will make this noise in the modifier stack to be controlled by this empty. So let me just present what I'm talking about. Maybe that's gonna be easier to understand. So in this displace modifier, we change the coordinates from local to object, and we choose the object being cape controller. And so now whenever this cape controller is moving, you can see that the noise is moving as well. And I know that right now this whole displacement ruins everything, so let's fix it right away. With this cape selected, let's go into the top view and then hold down tab and choose a weight paint. And then up here in this menu, let's choose the gradient and create the gradient on our vertices that is gonna be affected by the displace modifier. So just make sure that the beginning of the cape, that's around shoulders, is fairly blue. It doesn't have to be totally blue, but like quite dark, so that these vertices will not be affected as much. Maybe something like that. Or let's even begin from the end of the cape itself. So just to make sure that all the vertices in the bag are in red, and then as we go further, let's make the cap front something like this. And now we can go back into the object mode, because what we just did is we created a vertex group named group. Let's rename it as well to cape displacement. And then in the modifier stack, in the displace modifier, the vertex group that we want to be affected by this displace is the one that we just created. And now to make this cape actually flap around, we have to animate this empty. And to do that, on the first frame of the animation, let's click I and choose location. So we are basically keyframing the location of the empty right now. And then let's move to, let's say, frame 10, and then move the empty a little bit on the y-axis or x-axis, depending on how your character is rotated. Just make sure it goes along the cape. And then again, I and location again. Now let's hover over this timeline and click T and choose linear to change the interpolation between the keyframes. And now when you click play, then you can see that the cape is moving, but it's only moving up until 10th frame. So again, similarly as we did before making the character loop, we want to go over and click Shift E and choose linear extrapolation, which is gonna extrapolate the movement of the empty based on those two keyframes that we have. So for example, if we play this right now, then you can see that it's quite fast. And if we want to slow it down, then all we need to do is just move this keyframe a little bit further, and that will make this empty a little bit slower, which in turn makes the displacement move a little bit slower as well. It's pretty self-explanatory. I'm sure you're getting the gist of it already. So I will keep it at maybe 15 or something. And then the next thing is the scale of the empty. As we scale it up, we can see that the noise that is affecting our cape is scaling as well. So adjust it to something that resembles cape flapping on the wind. Maybe I'll put it on the 10th. It was actually quite nice. So this looks alright already. Let's choose the cape and shade it smooth as well. And then in the modifier stack, let's add another modifier, displace. And here click new again to add a new texture. And this time it's gonna be cloak displacement small, because those are gonna be the small details which will actually play a greater role later when we will be texturing and building our shader. So also in the modifier stack, you can see that this displacement is named displace and this displace 001. You can instead call it big and small, just so when we go to this texture tab, we see for which displace modifier we are choosing the texture. So this time it's gonna be for the small one. And let's also make the size of this texture quite small, maybe something like 0.1. And then in the modifier stack, make sure that the strength is being very low as well. We want only those little soft bumps here and there. And you can also choose the group, cape displacement, if you want the front of the cape to be totally smooth, but I will keep it like this, because I feel like those little subtle bumps will actually look nice in the end. So that's how it looks like for now. And then because it's a cape, and right now what we're working with is a plane, we need a little bit of thickness to it. So let's add another modifier, and this time it's gonna be a solidify modifier. We can also close the previous one so that we see clearly what we're doing. Here, let's just choose the offset to be 0 so that when we change the thickness, it's getting thicker equally on top and the bottom. Let's also not go too crazy with it. A small value just to add a little bit of thickness to the whole thing. And then the last step is another subdivision surface modifier, which is gonna smooth out everything and make it look even more like a cloth material. Here you can keep it at the 1 level, because all we care about is just smoothing out the edges and the sharp corners, so you can just leave it as it is. And now, as you can see, when we play the animation, the cloak is clipping through the leg of our character. So just to make sure that it flaps above that, we can select the cape, go into the edit mode. And because we are using this modifier stack, we only have those few vertices that we have to take care of in order to change the shape of the cape. So let's select all of those and move them a little bit higher, maybe something like this, just to make sure that we have enough room for legs. And then when we play the animation, then we have this nice cape flopping around. Maybe let's also connect it to the shoulders of our character actually. So again, edit mode. If it's not very comfortable for you to see with all the modifiers applied, you can go to the modifiers tag and just deselect these icons, which are making the modifiers being previewed even in edit mode. So just for the clear vision, it's worth to just turn it off when you're modifying the underlying shape of the cape. So I will put it somewhere here, maybe those like so, and then all of them lower like this. So now when I play, the cape is closer to the body. But another problem is you can see that the body is actually moving a little bit, it's like floating a little bit, and our cape stays in one place all the time. So we need another object constraint to make sure that the cape is actually following our armature, our model. So with the cape selected, go down to the constraints tab and add a object constraint child of again. And this time the target is gonna be the armature, the one that we imported from Mixamo, and the bone I will choose to be spine 2. And now you can see that this whole mesh just moved because it is being offset from the bone that we chose by the same amount that it was offset before from the world origin. So in order to quickly fix that, just hold Alt and click G to reset its location, and then it should snap to the bone that it's following, and then we can just go to the side view and position it and rotate it so that again it fits our character quite well. And with this done, we can play the animation and we can see that the cape is now following the character. It is clipping for me right now, so I will just adjust those vertices, and you can see that we have a little bit of clipping here as well, so just make sure to adjust that before we move to the next step. But also you can just leave it as it is, and you can always adjust it later, right before you render, for example. And also you can see that the displacement now moves these vertices as well as it's moving through, and so it is because it's controlled now by this vertex group. And just so you know, you can always go to the object data properties and then with all the vertices selected in the edit mode, remove all of them and then go back into the weight paint, and you can paint again the gradient by yourself. And so if you leave this area completely blue, then this beginning of the cape is not being affected as much anymore, and it stays on the place where you put it. So just something to keep in mind, that everything that we do here can be always adjusted at any given time. And now I think it's time to move on to the shading. So first of all, you can see that this armature already has sort of colors, sort of material applied. So just make sure that you go in there and click this minus button to remove all the materials that it may have before, because we will not be using them, we will create our custom ones. So let's start with the cape. Let's select it and then drag in a new viewport and change it from viewport to shader editor, and then click new to create a new material. We can delete the principled BSDF as well. And this material is very simple. All we need is a Fresnel node and a color ramp. Let's connect them like so. And then let's go to the render preview and let's preview the color ramp itself. So the preview, for any of you that doesn't know, the shortcut for it is Ctrl Shift and left mouse button on the node, but you have to have a node wrangler enabled in your add-ons. So make sure that you do, because we will use this add-on a lot. It comes with Blender pre-installed, so it's just a great tool to have enabled all the time. So now our Fresnel and the color ramp give us this result. And firstly, let's change the interpolation from linear to constant to have this stylized hard edges. And now all it is basically adding a color stop to the color ramp and adjusting the values. So you could see that in my intro scene, my cape was red, so I will go with this again. So I will make this darkest color something like this. Then the slightly brighter is gonna be the same but with slightly higher value, and then the third very similarly, even higher value. Now let's adjust those, and right now it is very saturated and very harsh, and we could go one by one through all these colors and just decrease the saturation, but much easier is just add a hue saturation node right after that and just decrease the saturation here, because I found that these saturated colors just look a little bit nicer when it comes to cell shaded stuff. So that would be it for the base. And now what we want is we want those vertical lines in the darkest part of our cape, sort of like a hatching in manga drawings. So for that we will need a noise texture, and with this node selected, click Ctrl T, another shortcut coming from the node wrangler, which is gonna give you mapping and texture coordinates. Now here we will change the texture coordinates from generated to UVs, and let's also bring it up and get a value node, a math node, and a combine XYZ node. Now for those of you who watched my previous videos, this may not be anything new, but for all the new viewers, it's just a simple setup that allows me to scale the texture, the noise texture that will apply here. It allows me to basically stretch it on one of the axes. So let's connect it like so and change the math node from add to divide. And then the combine XYZ goes into the scale of the mapping node. Now as you preview the noise texture And we can also add a color ramp to have a little bit greater contrast. So with that previewed, you can see that nothing's there right now because this value here is 0. So let's put it to 1. And now as we increase the divide value, you can see that our texture is getting stretched and stretched more and more. And that is because we basically stretch the noise texture on the y-axis. So right now let's change this color ramp also from linear to constant. And as you bring the white value a little bit lower, you can see the stripes happening. If you want them smaller, then you have to increase the noise texture scale. So something like this. You can also play with the roughness and the detail depending on the effect that you're going for, or even use your own custom hatching that you want to use for the cape, because all we're gonna do right now is we're gonna take these noise texture lines and we will use a mix RGB node, and with it set to darken, we will connect our basic color of the cape and also the hatching. And if you preview that right now and bring the factor all the way up, you can see what's going on, but we want this to be only on the darkest areas. So we have to use another math node and now connect it like so, coming from the color ramp, and change it from add to less than, and then the result goes into the factor. Now as you bring down the less than threshold value, you can see that the areas affected are less and less. And if you have this problem as I do right now, that the hatching is actually everywhere and just the color is on a smaller and smaller area, just change the order in which the hatching and the color is being connected with this mix RGB node. So let's just switch it like that, and this should give you the proper result. So I will just adjust this a little bit, the noise, because I don't quite like it right now. Maybe something like this, and also stretch it a little bit, but feel free to spend as much time here as you want and adjust it until you're happy with it. Now the last thing to do is get an emissive node, because we want this scene to be working without any light information. We want this to have this stylized look, and the best way to achieve that is just connect everything to the emission node and keep the strength at 1. Alternatively, if you want this cape, for example, to glow, to emphasize it more in your scene, then you can go into this render settings and enable bloom, and then as you increase the emission strength, the higher the value of the color is, the more it's gonna bloom away. I just realized this actually looks like a muscle tissue or some meat or something. That's actually great. Maybe that's idea for another tutorial, how to make a stylized meat. If you would like to see that, then make sure to let me know in the comments, because that sounds like a really cool thing to explore. But anyway, back to the tutorial. So with the cape done, let's select the character. And here we want to use actually very similar setup. So we can simply go to this drop down list and choose the material that we just created. And so while we add it, let's also give it a proper name, just to keep it organized. And now you can click this icon, which is gonna duplicate this material. So we will be able to make some changes without affecting the cape itself. And let's also give it a different name as well. And so for this character, I want something very simple. So I will just keep it as it is, and just choose the saturation to be 0 to make it black and white basically. And also I want to change the hatching a little bit. Again, you can use any custom hatching. There is many great tutorials online about achieving a really cool results in Blender. So you can even use that. But in my case, I will delete all this setup that's controlling the scale, change the texture coordinates from UV to object, and instead of using the noise texture, I will actually use a wave texture. So we can get rid of this and connect this one instead. And now let's bring down the scale so we can see this pattern a little better. Something like 1 maybe. And add a distortion. Yeah, maybe something like this. That's fine. Also, if you want to control where it appears, then again, back to the color ramp that controls the color, you can just manipulate those color stops to either increase or decrease the area where this hatching is gonna appear, and also the brightest point as well. So I'll just leave it at something like this. So that's already looking fine in my opinion. So that's that. The character and the cape is done, and now it's time to create some background. So actually before that, let's add a camera as well, so that we can start compositing our shot. So with the camera selected on the scene, you can actually go and navigate in your viewport to whatever shot you're looking for, and then click Ctrl Alt and 0 on the numpad, and that is gonna align the camera to your viewport view. And now we can use this second view back to the viewport, where we will be constructing our background. So first Ctrl A, Mesh, Plane, and also let's rotate it by 90 degrees so that it's upwards and also in the same alignment as our character, because those will be the planes that will have the action stripes on to give our character, our whole scene, a sense of speed and velocity. So we will position it in between the camera and the character, and then just scale it up. You can scale it up as crazy as you want. Just make sure that in the camera there is no empty spaces in here. Then also let's change the name to Speed Stripes, and back in this viewport let's change it again to the shader editor. And instead of creating new material, we can again reuse what we did before. So let's choose the cape matte and again this button to duplicate it and change it to stripes. Here we don't need that many nodes, so we can delete all the bottom half, and then let's preview this color ramp, and we actually already have the stripes that we need. You can adjust it further by manipulating these values again. I'll just bring the roughness down, and a very important thing is change the texture coordinates from UV to object. That is because right now we have this plane, and we can go to object, apply scale, and you can see that the scale is now very small, but then if you find the need later to scale it up or down, then you can do so, and then as you apply the scale again, the size of your stripes will be consistent, so that you don't have every single time adjust all those little values, but you just make it right once, and then as long as the scale is applied, it should stay the same size. So now let's make sure that it looks right. Let's bring down the scale of the noise texture itself. And also this color ramp, we only want those white values to be something like this. We can also bring down the roughness to have a little bit clearer lines. And then if you want to stretch it more or less, again, this divide value is your friend. Now one problem you may notice is that we don't see our character anymore, and that is because we need a transparent BSDF node and also a mix shader node. Now let's connect it like so. The transparent is on the top and emission on the bottom, and then the factor is gonna be this color ramp. Now, as we preview this one, you can see that we still cannot see anything behind, and that is because we need to go to the material properties and change the blend mode from opaque to alpha clip, which is gonna take all the black values and make them transparent basically. Now the next step is to animate those stripes, because as you play the animation, you can see that it's static, so it doesn't help us in any way. So we can do that in the mapping node right here. We can simply change the Y location of the texture coordinate, and that should look like as if the stripes are actually flying through. So in order to control this value, we can use a driver. So type in a hashtag frame and then divide it by, let's say, 50, which is gonna alter the value here based on the current frame of the animation. So you can see as we scrub through, then it's moving, but it's moving in the wrong direction. So all we need to do is just add a minus at the beginning, and then if you want the stripes to move faster or slower, you just need to change this number. The bigger the division is, the slower the stripes will fly. So with like 100, you can still see it flying, and then like 10, it's going super fast. I will leave it at 30 and also change the scale a little bit to make them quite small so that we can still see our character. And maybe adjust this color ramp a little bit, something like this. Now we can go back to the 3D viewport, and as we have stripes that are in front of our character, we want another level that is gonna be behind. So simply duplicate this object and place it behind our character. You can also make it much bigger, and as you can see, as I mentioned before, the size of the stripes changed. But then we go object, apply scale, boom, the same size across. But the problem is now that they are so dense, and also they are the exact copies of each other, that it doesn't look that nice. So what we can do about it is we can go back to the shader editor and we can move those nodes out of the way a little bit and then change the noise texture from 3D to 4D. And what that does is give us this value, which is basically a seed for the noise texture. And what we want is a object info node and this random value, which basically gives us a random value for each object. So we just plug that into the W value and that fixes our tiling issue. Let's also make those lines a little bit less so that we can still see the character. And as you click play, you should already see the lines nicely flying through and giving our character a sense of speed. Now with all this done, all we need to do is create some background for our scene. So for that again, Shift A, Mesh, Plane, and now let's move it out of the way quite a bit. And this time, because it's a background, we want it to be perpendicular and actually blocking everything that we can see through the empty space in here. So just make sure that it's covering all this empty space in here. And what we also want is we want it to be aligned with the camera, so that no matter how we will rotate or move the camera, our background will always face it directly. So with the background plane selected, go into the object constraints, child of, and this time the target is the camera. Now we can go into the top view and make sure that the rotation is perpendicular or something close to our camera. And then as we will move our camera around the scene and even rotate it, you can be sure that this plane is gonna follow through, and make sure that there is no empty transparent spaces anywhere in your frame. You don't also have to make it so gargantuous, you can even make it like so. Always make sure that it's covering all the space. So with this background plane selected, let's also make sure that we apply the scale and go back to the shader editor. Here let's create new material, and this is gonna be background. Delete the principled BSDF and get a emission shader again. And here we will actually start with a gradient texture node. And now with the gradient texture selected, click Ctrl T again to get the mapping and texture coordinates node. And now we can change the texture coordinates from generated to camera, so that it will stay aligned to the position of our camera, which is gonna just simplify the whole process for us. So no matter how we rotate the camera, this diagonal gradient will basically stay the same. Now let's bring down the scale to very low, something like 0.01. to get a much softer gradient. And now we can manipulate this location XYZ to position this gradient a little bit closer to the middle of our scene, as well as the rotation Z to rotate it so that it roughly goes from one corner to another. Or let's move it even further, so it takes a bit more. And we can add a math node right behind the gradient texture and set it to power. And now we can control even more the softness of our gradient. And now let's add those diagonal stripes. So for that we'll need another wave texture. Let's plug it right here. And let's duplicate this mapping node and connect it again from camera. The reason why we want this to be duplicated is because we want this gradient to always stay the same and have an independent way of controlling the wave texture basically. So with this wave texture, I want them to go sort of like this, in this direction. I will also increase the scale to make them much smaller, and I will add a color ramp right after to control the contrast of the lines. So I will change it again from linear to constant and bring down the white value, something like this. Now let's combine this gradient and those lines, and we can do that using a math node. So simply copy this power node and change it to multiply, and then connect those two values like so. And then as you preview that, you can see that the lines are more visible on this corner than they are on this corner, which I think gives a nice depth to our scene. Now, one thing that we can do that you could also see in the intro is we can also distort these lines a little bit, because right now they are pretty static, and we can also make them complement the whole velocity and the movement of our scene by animating that noise that goes through them as well. So first of all, I will need a noise texture somewhere around here. Let's move it here to get some space. Now I want to take this mapping node vector and connect it to the noise texture. So let's preview that and increase the scale and also the roughness and the detail quite a bit. We want it to be quite noisy. And then this factor output goes into the wave texture detail scale. And as we preview that, you may see that nothing actually happened. And that is because we need to increase a little bit of the distortion in the wave texture. And as we do that, you can see that there is areas where the noise is super strong and also the areas where it doesn't affect those lines that much. So let's also manipulate this noise texture to get a little bit better result, something like this maybe. And also let's give this wave texture a little bit higher scale, so we have more of those lines and make them thinner actually. And maybe the distortion is a little bit too strong, so I'll bring it down just a little bit, just something like this. And now in order to animate this, we need to change the noise texture from 3D to 4D and do what we did before, so add a driver to our W value. So again, hashtag frame, and we can use the same divider 30 so that it's aligned more or less with the dynamism of our scene. And that is it for our background. Just make sure that you're connecting it to the emission before it goes to the material output surface. And then the very last step is add a camera filter, which is gonna be just a plane with a texture that is gonna be right in front of the camera, and that is gonna have an influence on the whole scene. So again, Shift A, mesh plane, and now let's add the object constraint right away, child of the camera, and we can actually select it and then select the camera as well, and then Shift H to just hide everything else, just so we can see better what we're doing. Now let's move it closer to the camera and just position it and align it and just make sure that it's right in front of the camera and it covers everything. And now we can go to the shader editor and add a new material, and this is gonna be our camera filter. Again, we can delete the principled BSDF and add a emission shader, and this time we want to start with a Voronoi texture. Again, Ctrl T to get the texture coordinate and mapping, and again the texture coordinate comes from camera. Now let's preview the Voronoi texture and increase the scale a little bit. And what we are interested in this time is actually not the distance but the color output. So we have those all different colors So we have those cells of different colors, and that is what is gonna drive our noise texture. But before we plug it directly in there, we need a mix RGB node. And now we want to mix the mapping vector and the Voronoi texture color. And let's change the mix to linear light, and this will distort the original coordinates by this Voronoi texture. And if we plug that to the noise texture, you can see that in result, we have a noise texture that is being offset differently in a different cell of the Voronoi texture. So now we can get already a color ramp and plug it right after here. And here we can play with the contrast of our noise. And let's bring up the roughness all the way up and the details quite high as well, maybe something like 9. We can also add a little bit of distortion to it as well, maybe like 1, which already gives us an interesting filter to look through. And in order to visualize it, we will need the similar setup as with the stripes. So a transparent BSDF and a mix shader. Let's connect it like so. And the color ramp is gonna be the factor. And as we preview mix shader, make sure that the material is sent in blend mode from opaque to alpha blend this time. And also in the scene, you remember we hide all the meshes that we didn't need. So now just click Alt H to unhide everything, and 0 again to get back to our camera view. So this filter already affects our scene, as you can obviously see. So now as we control this color ramp, we can see how much of it is visible. So I will set it to something like this. And then one neat trick is if we use a math node right before it goes to the mix shader and set it from add to subtract, then you can see that even though it's just the material that's affecting our plane, that is the camera filter, when this clamp is not checked, so when the value is able to basically drop below 0, we can control not only the plane that has this material applied itself, but also everything that is being displayed behind it. So even those stripes in here are sort of disappearing as we increase this subtract. And then as you go too high with the value, you get some like really weird result, with even like emission being emitted from some regions of the cape. So I will keep this subtract at 0.1 for now. And first I want to refine my filter, and then we can see what we can do with it. Also for further control, we can get another color ramp right after the first one and then change it from linear to B-spline. And that is just much softer gradient that we are achieving with the B-spline compared to the linear gradient. So we can just play with this a little bit. So now let's go to the beginning of the graph and grab another Voronoi texture, connect it to the mapping node, and then let's change it from F1 to distance to edge. And now if you preview this, we have this sort of like crystal looking structure or something, and we can add a color ramp right behind it. And then as we increase the black value, we can see that those lines in between are getting thicker and thicker. And so what we can do is we can get an invert node and plug it right behind the color ramp. And you cannot see that much right now, but what it does, it basically inverts the values here. So what's black here is white and vice versa. And we can actually use a mix RGB node, and then let's move those nodes out of the way so they don't distract us. And let's connect this noise texture output and also this invert in here and change the mix to multiply and the factor to 1. And as we preview this may not seem like much of a difference between this noise texture, but then as you plug it into this color ramp and then preview the end result, you can see what it does. So we can adjust it via this color ramp, and you can see that we are getting this sort of harsh contrasty cutouts of the pattern on our texture, or basically on our whole render, which I think gives off a really nice result. So I'll just keep it like that. And that is the camera filter for you. So now you can adjust those two color ramps and the subtract as well to control the result. As you increase the black values in the color ramp, the less and less of the pattern is being visible. And then the subtract basically controls how this camera filter affects the rest of the world. So I like to keep it at something quite low, like 0.05. And again, if you don't want this to affect whatever is behind, you can just click clamp. And this way, this subtract is only gonna control the plane that this material is applied to. But I kind of like it, that it's sort of a global value that lets me control everything. So I like to keep it at something maybe like this. And also let's bring in this value. And then at any given time, we can go back to our background. Let's also name it, by the way. And this one was the camera filter. So again, back in this background plane, we had this gradient texture, the diagonal gradient texture, we can still move it closer and further, depending on what you're going for. And it really, really nicely blends with the camera filter that is applied. Now, the very last thing to do in terms of the shading is, as you click play, you can see that right now that this camera filter thingy is all the time on the screen and is not moving. And I just feel like it would be really nice if we could animate this as well. So we can just pop into this camera filter material, and just as we did before, in this Voronoi texture, the distance to edge, we can change it to 4D, and the W vector is gonna be controlled by the driver. So again, frame divided by 30. This value seems to work for us quite well. And this already adjusts some aspects. And the next thing that we can also animate is this noise texture. So again, 4D, the W value is frame divided by 30 again. And we can also go into this Voronoi texture and maybe change the scale a little bit so that those patches where we delete the stripes, so that they don't end in a smooth line, are a little bit bigger, which I feel may look better. If you want to render the animation as it is, then you can go ahead and just do that. But I want to also share with you this really, really cool technique of moving the camera that I took partially from Polyfjord. I recommend his channel. I mean, he's doing amazing stuff and it's usually packed with knowledge. I mean, each of his episodes, so definitely recommend that. But what it basically is let's go to the 3D viewport and select the camera. Now we can also change it to the rendered preview so we can actually see what we're doing while we're doing it. And let's go to the first frame of the animation. And let's say we put the end of the animation to something like 600. It doesn't really matter right now how much you put in here. Just make sure that you have long enough for you to do all the camera movement that you will. Because what we will do is we will make this camera and we will move it around the scene, and at the same time we will record its movement with this auto keying feature. But right now, as we move the camera, you can see that we would have to move it and then rotate it and then move it again and then rotate it, which is very slow and painful process. So what we can do instead is, in this camera, we can go to the constraints and add object constraint, but this time it's not gonna be a child of, but track to. And what we will do is we will track the rotation of our camera to whatever we choose in here. And so we want to choose the armature and more specifically the bone. I will go with head, but you can track to any bone that you want. And right now in this viewport, as we move the camera, you can see that no matter where we are, we always are facing the head bone of our mesh. And so because we set the plane of the background and also the camera filter to follow our camera, basically, we have those things unchanged as we move through the world. The only thing that's not moving with our camera is the character and also the speed lines, because the speed lines should be aligned with the character itself and not with the camera. So with that, we can go to the camera settings and change the focal length to something like 80. So we have a nice zoom. And also in the top view, let's move it slightly further away from our object. And now while looking at it from sort of this perspective, we will create this flyby shot. So going in closer and then moving out from our object, something like this. So in order to key this animation as it progresses, we simply have to click this icon and enable auto keying. And then when we click play, we just have to move the camera as we want it to move. So something like this, then we click pause and we can see we have all those keys already done for us. But now the problem is, like, maybe your hand shakes or something. This movement may appear choppy. I mean, it all depends on the movement of your hand that you do with your mouse. So in order to make it smooth, I mean, let me make a better example out of it. So again, auto keying, play, and then I move the camera and let's say my hand is shaking like so. Then I pause it, turn off auto keying, and then you can see that the animation is like not very nice. I mean, it's shaking, it's not very stable, but we can smooth it in the graph editor. So we can just select all the frames, click A, and then Alt O to smooth it. And then you can just hold down Shift and R to repeat the same action quite a few times. You can see how this graph is getting smoother and smoother. And then when you click play, then even though my mouse work was super choppy, this whole animation comes out really nice, I think, in my opinion. I mean, compared to the previous. So that's just something I wanted to share with you guys because I thought it's really amazing tip. And again, big thanks to Polyfjord. If he ever watches this, then great. And if not, you can go to his channel and thank him in person in comments because he's the first person I've seen this feature being used by. So we can again just delete all the keyframes, go to the viewport, and now let's try to do a actual good job. So let's move this camera to something like here for the start position, enable auto keying, play, and we just move it in here. Then we speed up and something like this. That's okay. Then we go back, we change the animation to whatever length we want it to be. For example, 160. You can see that it doesn't really fit right now. I mean, I have way more keys than I needed. So I can basically use the same techniques as I do for modeling. So just hit S and then scale it down a bit so that it fits within the animation frames that I have set up here. And then go back to the graph editor, select everything, Alt-O, which is smoothing the keyframes, and then Shift-R, hold it for quite some time. I mean, don't make it too smooth because then it doesn't look as good, but just make sure that the transitions are smooth. And then you can see the result in real time. And I think that's amazing. Maybe the stripes in the background are a little bit too thick and there is too little of them, so we can always adjust that. That's the background plane. So wave texture, increase the scale. We want this only to be the background. We don't want this to take too much of our attention. Something like this. And yeah, that would be it for the tutorial. Again, the cape, if you don't like how it looks like, you just go into the edit mode and you can make it, I don't know, something ridiculous. And it all works. One more thing that you may want to do, and I will keep it as a, let's say, a little extra for every one of you that made it this far in the tutorial, is the outlines of the object. Because right now, as you can see, we don't really have this outline that is associated with basically anything manga-like or anime-like. And I think the easiest and the fastest way to achieve that basically is a technique called inverse hole, and that's something I got from the Blender Secrets channel, which I also recommend. I mean, very useful tips and presented in a super approachable way. So again, can only recommend that. But basically how you apply that is, let's select our cape and then go to the modifier stack, and we need to add another modifier, which is gonna be a solidify modifier. I know that we already have a solidify here, but we need this extra one, trust me. Now the important things here is under normals tab, click flip. So we are flipping the geometry basically. And then in materials, we want to set the material offset 1. And what it does is in the materials tab, you can see that right now we have just one material. So it's using this one. But because we set this offset to 1, it will use the second material instead of the first one. So we can click new and call it a outline. And then let's change this principled BSDF to emission again, and the color to black, because we want our outline to be black. And right now you can see that the whole cape turned black, and that is because one more thing we need to do is we need to check this backface culling. And with that, super easy way, super fast and super useful, we have a active outline of our mesh. And it doesn't work only for the outline, but also for, like, you see those details on the cape, which I think is really, really amazing. So if you made it this far, then there you go. A secret Blender tip that no one ever knew about. We can do the same for our character. So again, add a material and then choose the outline that we created before. And in the modifier stack under the armature, we add a solidify modifier, under normals flip it, and under materials change the offset to 1. And you may not see it that well, and that is because this thickness is very, very small. So in order to control how thick the outline is, you just simply make this thickness a bit more. You can also change the offset to 1 so that this model is not being shrunk, but the outline is being drawn outside of the mesh. And yeah, that is the actual end of the tutorial. I hope that you enjoyed it, I hope you learned something, and I hope this sparked some creativity in you and you're gonna use this technique for your own stuff. If you do, or if you even recreate this one, then please tag me on Twitter. I would really love to see that again. It's a huge motivation. I mean, you may think it's just the bullshit that every YouTuber is saying about how it motivates him to do another videos, blah blah blah. But this actually makes a difference when you see that your stuff influenced someone to do something cool. And without making this tutorial an hour long, I will see you in the next one. Bye bye.